Hello out there. Welcome to the Viking Lecture Series. My name is Juan Garcia. I'm a professor of history at the University of Arizona. I specialize in the history of the Americas, history of the United States, Mexican-American studies, and immigration policy. Today I'm going to be speaking to you about the Inca, one of the more fascinating but often overlooked pre-Columbian civilizations that existed for many periods before that. In this lecture, I'm going to cover the rise and fall of this great empire that briefly existed between the 15th and the 16th centuries. The word Inca means ruler in the Andean language of Quechua. It is now more generically used to describe the people who lived around Cusco beginning in the 12th century. The Inca, as we know them today, rose to prominence in the 15th century, and they successfully conquered and subjugated peoples across territories that reached from the northern Amazonian region in modern-day Ecuador to the southern deserts of modern-day Chile. At its peak, the Inca Empire was the largest in the Americas, and perhaps probably the largest known in the world at that point in time. It contained a population of about 12 million, which is fascinating because to support such a large population required a great deal of ingenuity to do so. The actual number of Inca themselves who ruled over this very large population was about 100,000. We're going to explore in this lecture how the empire grew and why it collapsed so suddenly. We're also going to examine the legacy of the empire, explore recent scholarship in terms of reevaluating its place in the history books, and examine its continued influence in modern-day Peru. What is interesting about the Inca Empire is that much of what they accomplished, and which I will discuss in a little while, they did so without the use of the wheel, nor did they have large animals like horses and oxen to help them in their construction projects. As far as we know, they did not have a formal system of writing, but yet they were able to maintain administrative control over a far-flung empire. Many of their projects were built in seemingly impossible places. In fact, if I were living among the Inca today and they asked me to construct some of these structures in the places that they chose, I would be hard-pressed to meet that demand. Next slide, please. This shows you the Andean civilization timeline. I'm not going to speak about all of these civilizations in depth, but just to give you a bit of highlight of the civilizations that preceded the Inca Empire. Down in your lower left-hand corner, you see the Norte Chico civilization. That is now recognized as the oldest known civilization in the Americas. The Chauvin civilization flourished from 900 BC to 200 BC. The Tiwanaku state had its capital in a monumental city of the same name, and it was located in the southern Lake Titicaca basin. The city of Tiwanaku was the Andes' most important destination for pilgrimages, and at its highest level of population, it held about 20,000 people in 800 AD. One of the more interesting civilizations was the Nazca civilization that existed between 100 BC and 800 AD. One of the things that makes them a great deal, that makes them very interesting, are the so-called lines that were discovered in 1939 by a pilot who was flying over the region. He noticed that as he looked down upon the territory, there were very intricate designs of hummingbirds, humpback whales, spiders, and also a whole slew of geometric designs. There were all kinds of theories as to why these designs in the earth were there and who placed them there. One of the more outlandish theories is that they were signposts left there by extraterrestrials. That theory was put forward by Eric von Daniken in his 1968 book, Chariots of the Gods. More recent theories, however, try to place these lines in a more realistic context. Some believe that these lines were created as part of the destination of pilgrims that they would follow as they did their religious duties. Others argue that they were astrological signs that would guide the planting and harvesting of crops. A third theory is that these lines really correspond to underground systems of water that are either underground rivers or underground streams. To this date, there has been no conclusive agreement by scholars, archaeologists, anthropologists, hydrologists as to what these lines mean. The Mocha civilization was another civilization that flourished. The Chimo civilization flourished around 1000 AD, and this Chimo civilization were later conquered by the Topa Inca Yupanqui about 1470. In the next slide, I'm going to give you an overview of these items. First of all, one thing we have to remember is that the Inca civilization accomplished these tremendous feats in a span of 95 years. Other Mesoamerican and pre-Columbian civilizations existed a much longer period. Civilizations like the Toltecs and the Mayas and the Aztecs, or the Mexicas as they were known. So the Inca really draw the admiration of scholars who look at what they accomplished in such a short time. Unfortunately, much of the culture and history of these people have been lost or destroyed. When the Spaniards ultimately conquered the Incas in the 16th century, they destroyed many of the structures that the Inca had constructed. They destroyed much of their knowledge, believing that they were demonic characterizations of the culture. And so much of it has been lost. What we do know has been largely written by the victors. And of course, their description of the Incas provide a very skewed and biased view of these people, often describing them as primitive, superstitious, barbaric, and uncivilized, and therefore worthy of being conquered and destroyed. Fortunately, we do have the work of one Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, who argued that he was a descendant of Inca nobility, who was both fluent in both Spanish and Quechua, and who published a detailed account of life under the Inca in 1650. He began the work in 1590, and it was really not so much a chronicle of the Inca so much as a very lengthy letter to the king, King Philip III of Spain, trying to describe the Inca civilization and in some ways trying to persuade him to protect the Inca from the predations and the exploitation and the oppression of the Spanish who had taken over that region. Unfortunately, there is no evidence that the king ever read the person's narrative. What is interesting about the chronicle, besides getting a first-person view from one of the descendants of the Inca, was that the Ayala also included in his chronicle 400 illustrations. And if you look up in the upper right-hand corner, you see one of those illustrations that was drawn by the Ayala. It's been argued that the Incas did not have written languages, and that makes deciphering the Inca civilization a little bit more difficult. However, that again is being re-examined. What they did find was a series of knotted relics that were called quipus. And these were designed to deliver information and maintain accounting within the Inca Empire. So initially, many of those who studied the quipu, or the quipu, which is Quechua for knots, believed that they were just simply for accounting purposes. But now some believe that there were other purposes in terms of describing what went on in Incan civilization, and maybe hold the key to a language, although there's been no Rosetta Stone found to help decipher that. To this date, maybe 850 quipu or knots exist. And I'll speak a little bit more about their role and their makeup a little bit later on. There are continuing mysteries regarding the Inca. Certainly one of the biggest mysteries is the mountaintop habitat of Machu Picchu. But it's also a question of how they were able to govern such a vast empire so efficiently and so effectively. And all kinds of theories have emerged, some which are outlandish, like extraterrestrials guiding the construction of much of the Inca architecture, all the way to the idea that the Incas really were an autocratic form of government that really deserved to be destroyed. In the next slide, please, we have an overview. And we're going to talk about, in this section, the region called the Land of Four Quarters. In this slide, we look at Tawantinsuyu. Tawantinsuyu means the land of the four quarters in the Quechua language. You can see from the map on your right that it was a very long and narrow patch that the Incans controlled. They really controlled some of the most difficult and some of the most challenging terrain in the world. They were constantly being affected by floods, droughts, and earthquakes. Feeding and maintaining a population of 12 million was a challenge in this very challenging environment. You can see that their empire, when completed, ran to about 2,500 miles from the north to the south. It stretched from the Pacific to the Andes. Sometimes the empire was no longer than 50 to 75 miles in width. You can see that it ran from sea level to a height of almost 23,000 feet. And as I said, it had a population of 12 million people. The Inca really believed in the power of the provinces that they governed. The Incan emperor was known as the Supa Inca, or the only Inca. Their empire consisted of a central government with the Sapa Inca at its head, that was then governed by 4 provincial governors with leaders known as Apus. At its peak, the Inca Empire had over 80 different provinces and governed people that spoke at least 30 to 40 different languages and had their own cultures and religions that they practiced. One thing that the Inca did allow under their leadership was that when local regions came under rule, they were allowed to continue their religious practices. This in some ways was a very smart approach to the issue because it helped to reduce some of the tension and resentment that the people that they had subjugated held toward the Incas. People who lived under Incan rule were required to give a portion of their agricultural produce to the Central Empire, and there was also a requirement of mandatory public service, which I'll talk about later. In return, the Inca government provided the subjugated people with security, protecting them from other enemies, provided them with food in times of need, housing, clothing, and occasional feasts to help them celebrate religious Inca festivals and religious beliefs. In this chapter, we're going to look at expansion and subjugation. So next slide, please. When you look at the history of the empire, it is one of constant expansion and warfare. The first emperor was named Pachacute, who ruled the empire from 1438 to 1471. Under his leadership, the Incas reconfigured the capital city of Cusco and made it the center of the empire. They also established some institutions to govern this vast empire. For example, Pachacute set up an army, He developed governmental structures for ruling. He found ways to keep track of the taxes that were required of the people that they pay the empire. He began and completed immense infrastructure projects across the entire realm. This included its most famous road network that would eventually span the entire territory. There was also a system of obligatory public service called the mita, M-I-T apostrophe A. That is that men between the ages of 15 and 50 were required to contribute labor free of charge to the government when the government called upon them. It was this free system of labor that made the construction of over 200 structures possible. One thing that the Incas did to control dissent was that they often removed entire populations from their homes under a system that they called the metameas, that permitted central authorities in Cusco to move populations in order to work on public works projects. This often allowed the removal of discontented elements from having great influence in those regions. The empire installed an apparatus of administration and taxation that gave the Cusco elite and their absolute ruler, the Sapa Inca, complete control. Here you can see in the left-hand illustration the Inca Huayna Capac at war. You notice how he's carried on a litter, leading his troops into combat. In the right-hand panel, you see the Incas involved with overcoming the Mapuches, adding them to their vast empire. Next slide, please. The 95 years were characterized by the rule of 3 generations from the same family. As I said, the first Inca emperor name was Pachacute. The last emperor was Atahualpa. If you notice the dates of their reign, it is shocking. Pachacute ruled for several decades, whereas Atahualpa, the last Inca emperor, ruled for about a year. Before the Incas came to power, they were just one of many organizations that were vying for existence in this land. In about 1438 or thereabouts, the Incas were attacked by the warlike neighboring Chanca people. The Chanca people were fearful warriors that often struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. One of their practices was to carry the mummified remains of one of their great leaders into battle. They believed that as long as they carried this leader into battle with them, they could not be defeated. One of the Inca leaders was called Inca Viracocha. He had a son that adopted the name Pachacute. That means he who remakes the world. Pachacute led the remaining Inca warriors into battle against the Chanca. The other Incas had been led away by their leaders back into the protection of the city, hoping that they would fend off these attackers. But Pachacute was bold, he was brave, he was daring, and he realized that if he could break into the center of the Chanca ranks and topple their deified mummy, that they would then be able to be defeated. And that's exactly what he did. It was a terrible battle, a bloody battle. But ultimately, Pachacute and his troops were able to break into the center, topple the mummy. The Chancas, shocked, were left in disarray and defeated. And this marked the beginning of the Inca Empire and the rule of this amazing person by the name of Pachacute. It was under his leadership that the city of Cusco was rebuilt. And by the way, the city of Cusco is in the form of a puma, whom the Aztecs admire for its strength and its predatory nature. By 1450, Pachacuti's armies controlled much of the Altiplano. Topa Inca Yupanqui was the 10th Sapa Inca and also a great military adventurer who expanded the empire. The empire expanded north and south, and in fact, he's been dubbed the South American Alexander the Great for the scale of his conquest. He was succeeded by Huayna Capic, who ruled between 1493 and 1525, who was equally expansionist and aggressive in spreading the Inca rule. And he has brought the empire to its zenith, conquering vast swaths of territories. Again, all this happened within a period of 95 years. Next slide, please. We're going to examine Cusco and Machu Picchu. It's hard to see, but if you look at the illustration on the left, the city of Cusco is laid out in the form of a puma. Now, some scholars debate whether that was really the intent, but you can see sort of the outline of the puma in that illustration if you look carefully. Cusco's name derives from the Quechua language for navel or center. The Incas came to believe that they were the highest civilization in existence. This, by the way, was not unusual. Other pre-Columbian civilizations made similar claims. For example, the Aztecs were really called themselves Mexicas. The Aztecs was a name that was imposed upon them by the Spaniards. The word Mexica is a Nahuatl word for navel or center of the world. So the idea that these highly advanced civilizations considered themselves to be at the height of civilization was not so unusual. Cusco, located around 11,000 feet above sea level, is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the Western Hemisphere. It was the administrative and spiritual center of the empire, and Cusco's population is estimated to have reached 200,000 at its peak in the 15th century. The emperor is credited with building the citadel of some Machu Picchu some 50 miles away. In the city of Cusco, you see on the right we have three items there listed. Okay. Sacsayhuaman was a fortress that was built on a steep hill overlooking the main city. In fact, the body of the puma, the city itself, was outlined by two rivers, and Sacsayhuaman was the fortress that made up the head. At its center was the square of Hakapata, which was a public square that was used for ritual and ceremony. At its height, it was filled with white sand, and it was surrounded with walls that were covered in gold panels. While the city is the center of the Inca Empire, the spiritual epicenter of the city is Coricancha. It is from here that four roads radiate out, leading to the four quarters or suyus of the empire. It formed the nucleus of a grand astronomical calendar and observatory, and it was considered the most sacred place in Inca society. The courtyard of the Coricancha was, in the eyes of the Spanish, quote, fabulous beyond belief. It represented a large golden field of corn in which were placed life-size models of shepherds, animals, birds, butterflies, and plants, all made from gold or silver. In addition, the courtyard contained jars covered with precious stones. Most of them were lost after the conquest. There are a series of pathways that emanate from the center of the city. These are called seques, and they're ritual pathways. And they lead to what is known as huacas, Huacas, which are considered sacred sites within the realm. These are natural formations left by nature, which the Inca believed were sacred and should be worshipped and honored by the empire. The next slide looks at Cusco today. You can see from the photograph that very little remains of the original Inca capital. Much of the capital was destroyed during the Spanish conquest. As they did in other places they conquered, the Spaniards built their new structures and civilization upon the ruins of the people they had conquered. But really what brought Cusco to complete destruction was not the Spanish conquest alone, but rather an earthquake that in 1650 did extensive damage to the remaining elements of culture, Incan culture in Cusco. An example of the original Inca substructure and Spanish colonial superstructure is found in the Church of Santo Domingo, which was consecrated in 1654. That church has elements of both the ancient Incan Empire and the Spanish who conquered that empire. Next slide, please. Sacsayhuaman. Sacsayhuaman means royal eagle in the Quechua language. This is a fortress that overlooks the city, and it was constructed during the reign of the Emperor Pachacute. Initially, the fortress was made of mud and clay, but Pachacute brought in skilled architects to build a massive stone structure using rocks that weighed up to 100 tons and were over 4 meters in height. This is where the mita, the required taxation of labor for the empire, came into play. The rocks were brought in from a nearby quarry, and they were roughly hewn into shape. Then they were moved. And remember, they have no beast of burden to do this. This is all done by human beings, by using logs or by wetting the field that they were being dragged over and making it muddy. These stones were then lifted up into place by ropes and pulleys, and they were set and hewed by stonemasons. And they were cut so precisely that they fit together perfectly, and there was no need for the use of mortar. That the structures that these people constructed had remained in place in a region frequently rocked by major earthquakes is a testament to the combined skills to which Inca masons went to insert these stones seamlessly into intricate patterns of the wall. You notice that they are laid out in a zigzag fashion to allow for maximum defense. Further protection comes from the fact that there is only one small entrance to each terrace, making the influx of large armies almost impossible. Ironically, this massive fortress was never really tested in conflict, as Cusco rarely suffered any major attacks from outsiders. Its more important function was therefore more as a ritual site. Here, the Incas worshipped their god Inti, the sun god, and conducted astronomical observations. By the way, these structures also served another purpose that was more psychological. These sites served to remind people of the power and majesty and ability of the Inca Empire. And therefore, it told them that resistance of this empire was futile. If an empire and its rulers and its people could construct such impressive structures, what chance would people have in overthrowing such a structure? That was the same purpose of the extensive the road network they constructed. Yes, it was important to communication, but was also a visible symbol of the power and might of the Inca Empire. Next slide, please. This is one of the more mysterious and fascinating sites within the Inca Empire. Machu Picchu, as it's correctly pronounced, was constructed between 1450 and 1460. Now, what was the purpose of this area? All kinds of theories have been bounded. One of the first to come across Machu Picchu, who was not from Inca background, was a Yale graduate explorer and adventurer by the name of Hiram Bingham, who in 1911 went searching for the lost city of Vilcabamba, which was the last outpost of the Inca Emperor Manco Capac II, who fell to the Spanish in 1572. In his exploration, he was informed by a local farmer whose name was Melchor Arteaga that there were ruins over a very treacherous path. He followed that path, which by the way was 5 days walk from Cusco, and he found this magnificent structure that was overgrown with vegetation. The word Machu Picchu simply means old mountains. Now, many of the locals knew that it existed, but either ignored it or never revealed it to the outside world. Bingham believed that he had finally found the lost city of Vilcabamba. And in fact, he took that belief to his grave. What he had actually found were the largely intact ruins of Machu Picchu. Now, what purpose did it serve? Initially, it was thought that it was a religious site, a holy site for the Inca Empire. But then questions arose. For example, when the Spaniards conquered the Incas and other empires, they often desecrated holy sites. Machu Picchu had no evidence that it had been raided or desecrated by the Spaniards. Secondly, there were other structures that raised questions about its purpose. Finally, it was decided by a fellow by the name of John Verano, who was a forensic anthropologist, that Machu Picchu was a retreat for the Incan royalty. It was a way that they could get away from the daily stresses of running an empire. The population of Machu Picchu was about 750 people. Excavations of the site found human remains, skeletal remains. Initially, Bingham, who took along a fellow by the name of George Eaton, who was a bone specialist, concluded that the skeletal remains they found were of women. One of the things that convinced Bingham that he had found Vilcabamba was that there were stories about large numbers of virgins who served the empire. The bone specialist, George Eaton, concluded that the ratio of female bones to male bones was 4:1. And therefore, this was the site where the virgins were buried. That theory lasted for a very long time until John Verano re-examined those skeletal remains. He found that the ratio that had been set forth by Eaton, the 4:1, women to men, was inaccurate. That a closer examination of the skeletal remains showed that the ratio was almost equal between men and women. And so therefore, they also found remains of children. So the question is, of course, virgins and children just don't add up. And so he theorized that Machu Picchu was really an elegant resort, and that many of the skeletal remains there were people who managed that resort in the absence of the Inca emperors. And so when the Inca emperors announced that they were going to go to the retreat, these servants and these property managers made the resorts ready for their arrival. When the empire fell, news of the fall of the empire did not reach this secluded retreat. And eventually many of the servants died of old age or simply faded away, and Machu Picchu fell into disuse. And next slide, please. We have Machu Picchu and the Temple of the Sun. One of the most sacred places within Machu Picchu is the Temple of the Sun, or Torreon. Viracocha is the god who is considered by the Incas to be the creator of everything. The god Inti, I-N-T-I, is the sun god, who is the giver of life and sustenance. This structure here was used as an for astronomical observations and to record movements of the sun. In fact, during the solstice, the sunshine shines on that metal structure there through that small window at the top of the picture. During solstices, priests could view the sun through two windows on the northern and eastern sides of the building. A giant rock known as the Intihuatana, or hitching post of Inti, remained one of Machu Picchu's enduring mysteries. The purpose of this carved stone, or huasca, again a sacred object, on its raised platform is still unknown, although some theorize that it was used for astronomical observations. In this slide, the overview, we move into politics and daily life. The question that has been raised in studying the Inca Empire, was it a gulag that exploited and oppressed people, or was it a utopia? These two sketches are from F. Guamampoma de Ayala. You see that agricultural workers are involved in collective efforts that are required by the social unit that they call the Ayu. The Ayu were made up of biological families or by people who married into the family, who pooled their resources and responsibilities and workload. The Incas came across this societal organization, the Ayu, and turned it to a more efficient way of serving the empire. Each Ayu would collectively work a common plot of land and was largely self-sustaining, that they then traded for all food and other goods required by the community. It functioned under clear codes of reciprocity with neighboring Ayus. Within the Ayu, there were systems in place to take care of the elderly, the sick, and the injured, and to make sure that everyone had the necessities of life that they needed. When natural disaster struck, such as during the El Nino years, Ayu communities were able to call upon the Inca state to intervene and to release food stocks and state warehouses. The Ayu were recruited and then later on forced by the Inca Empire to engage in projects that served the empire. Under the Ayu, men between the ages of 15 and 50 were required to devote certain numbers of days to the empire with their skills. Now that skill could be either as a stonemason, as a construction worker, as a soldier within the Inca army, or as a herder, or any other function that the empire had a need for. In fact, it was the Ayu who helped construct a vast network of terraces and irrigation works and roads that connected the Inca Empire. Were they happy under the system? Not likely, but there were benefits associated with it. In return for their labor, in return for their service to the Inca Empire, when hardships struck families and communities, the Inca Empire provided them with the necessities of life. It also protected them from outside forces. Also maintained law and order. Inca law was very harsh. If you broke the law, there was severe punishment. For example, if you stole something, you would lose your hand or your arm. Of course, that made you unable to work. But the Inca believed that you should be provided for, even though you had been responsible for your own disability. But the Inca also required you to take some action. And so one of the things that was required of you for the Inca Empire taking care of you is that you would have to sit in the square showing your lost arm or hand and explaining to them why you had lost it and expressing regret for what you had done and expressing warnings to those who would think about breaking the law. This slide, the next slide, shows the highway system. The highway system covered two regions, one along the mountains and the other one along the coast. And it consisted of an extensive network of roads and bridges that spanned 25,000 miles. They even had the ability to carve tunnels into the mountainsides. Again, you have to understand that they did this without the availability of iron tools. What were the roads used for? They were essential in maintaining control of this far-flung empire, which spanned over 2,500 miles. The roads were used for moving troops quickly to trouble areas, for transporting goods, and for transporting workers. The network here is shown in red on the map if you look carefully. Some of the roads are still visible today. The image on the bottom shows you some of those roads. The roads were between 1 to 4 meters in width. They also had trunk grades that were much wider. And they constructed these roads over a challenging landscape that represent astonishing feats of engineering along the steep mountainsides. You can see the rope bridge that was constructed over a deep gorge. And up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the Machu Picchu switchback. In the next slide, we get a glimpse of how they use these roads. First of all, the use of the roads was limited to official use. Only government officials, military personnel, messengers, and people delivering supplies could use the road. Sometimes private citizens were allowed to, but that had to be under very special circumstances. Laborers were often recruited to not only help further extend these roads, but also to maintain them. The highways were punctuated by what were known as tambos, T-A-M-B-O-S. They were way stations that offered rest and accommodation along the routes. The administrative centers had lodgings for state personnel that were known as kolkas, or storehouses that held surplus food and other goods. They also had administrative offices to and from which chasquis. Chasquis are runners who carried messages along the entire empire. And they carried those messages using the quipu or quipu, which again translates into knots. These were records that were transported up and down the highways from Cusco, forming a messaging system that united all elements of the realm. To interpret these interesting knotted items, there were quipu kamayaks, or keeper of the quipu, that's shown down at the bottom right. These were specially educated and trained people that had undergone years of education in reading and deciphering the meaning of these knots. And so they were invaluable to the empire. In this slide, the next slide, we get a little bit into the language of the knots, which is still a mystery. You notice that the knots were various lengths. Each strand held a variety of knots. Some of them were even color-coded. Most of them were destroyed by the Spanish conquistadors because they saw them as the work of the devil, but some survived. If you look at one strand, they tell you numbers. For example, that if you go from the crossbar to one strand down, at the top there is one knot. That represents hundreds. The second set of knots represents tens, and the third set of knots represents one. So for example, if you wanted to say 132, you would have one knot at the top, three knots at the middle, and two knots at the bottom, and that would be 132. Also, colors were included in that had certain meanings, such as red represented war, and other colors that were known to the interpreters of these knots. They have modern researchers have not yet been able to break the meaning, the code of these knots, but they continue to be studied. Up here in your upper right-hand corner, there is a book by Garcia and Robert Asher's Mathematics of the Incas that looks at this fascinating form of communication from the eyes of a mathematician and an anthropologist. Next slide, please. One of the more fascinating and impressive accomplishments of the Incas was their able to produce agricultural goods in such a harsh terrain and climate. What they did to overcome the lack of land for growing was that they began to build a number of terraces. Now the terraces are interesting because they not only provide increased land in which to grow agriculture, but they also are a means of flood control. The terraces consist of several parts. For example, at the top of the terrace that is flattened out, there is fertile topsoil. Then it's underneath that is another layer of fine grain and sand, and the third level is gravel and stone. And so then there are retaining walls to keep the area from being destroyed by floods. And so when the rain falls into this three-level area, then the rain kind of filters through it, reducing the possibility of flood. They also built channels to redirect the water into different directions. And so therefore they were able to control flooding, but also provide irrigation that was much necessary to maintaining the crops. Much of their diet was plant-based. And in fact, one of their staples was the potato. And they were able to cultivate over 200 varieties of potatoes. They also grew maize and quinoa that were also important food crops. Cotton was grown. And another important product that was grown was coca, which was used for dealing with headaches, also used as a medium of exchange, used for offering to the gods, and for people suffering from altitude sickness. The stone walls of each terrace absorbed the sun's heat during the day and then radiated at night. This helped prevent damage to frost-sensitive crops such as maize, and it allowed maize to be cultivated at high altitudes. The Incas then built irrigation systems into the terraces to allow for the distribution of mountain water along them. Maize is very demanding of water and nutrients, and sometimes the Incas maximize water retention and minimize erosion of topsoils by adding another layer of dung fertilizer that was taken from llamas. While mostly used for single crop growing, occasionally the Incas used a companion planting system known as the Three Sisters, whereby maize, beans, and squash would all be grown together in the same plot. The different crops then benefited each other. For example, maize provided stalks to support beans and shade for squash, while beans added nitrogen to the soil. In terms of the food, 1/3 was kept by the population because they had helped grow it. 1/3 went to supporting the priest who appeased the gods through their work, and 1/3 went to the emperor to feed his court. But the emperor also used 1/3 of the crops given to him as a way of putting them into storehouses so that they would be there in times of famine or need. In fact, they found interesting ways to store crops through their structures and found ways that they would preserve potatoes for up to 6 years, which again was an amazing accomplishment. In the next slide, we come to the textiles. This was one of the most valuable commodities in the Inca Empire. Now, the ancient textile traditions predated the Incas across the Andean region. Weaving was a highly esteemed craft and was carried out in every community, as well as in state workshops that produced clothing for the nobility and the army. The textiles that you see on this slide give examples of weaving before, during, and after the age of Inca. The lower right textile shows how weaving traditions remained a vital part of the community life after the arrival of the Spanish. Indeed, the textile weaving still thrives today. Both men and women were involved in weaving these interesting and valuable textiles. The finest textiles were produced by men known as kumpikayamaks, or keepers of the fine cloth. The Incas had different categories of cloth, from a coarse chusi, used for blankets, a finer undecorated ahuasca for daily use, and the finest umpi, which came from alpacas, for royal and ritual use that was used in burial ceremonies. There were principal colors used in the Inca textiles. They are red, yellow, orange, black, white, and green. The state required the production of textiles as a form of taxation. So individual designs often represented repetitive patterns that are traceable to a certain community or ayu. In that way, the ayu could prove, or the community could prove, that they had met their taxation requirements by simply showing the pattern of the textile that they had woven. In the next slide, we look at pottery, which was also highly valued in the Incan Empire. The Chauvin culture, from around 900 BC to 200 BC, was probably the first Andean civilization to develop pottery on a wide scale. They produced vessels often in the shapes of the jaguar, god, or other mythical animals. By the time of the Inca, ceramics were still produced without the benefit of a potter's wheel. Vessels were often made by coiling clay around a base, then smoothing the side with a flat stone. Other vessels were made using clay molds. Notice that the designs were pretty much consistent. And that is, again, another way that the communities under Inca rule could prove that they had met their taxation requirements by the designs that were unique to their community. The ceramics were pretty much used for practical uses. The most common vessel was the urpu, a bulbous pot for storing maize. Another storage vessel was used for chica, which was a beer brewed from maize for ceremonial purposes. One characteristic of Inca pottery is that, unlike prior Andean cultures, it did not portray the human form. That is, none of the pottery that were produced by the Inca had any indication of what they looked like. My theory is that is because they themselves did not personally produce the pottery, but rather the ayus who produced the pottery. And so therefore there was no opportunity for them to portray themselves in the textile and pottery work that they relied upon. Next slide, please. Although they had no money, they did see gold and silver as a valuable commodity. Gold was seen to be considered to be the tears of the sun god Enki. Silver were considered to be the tears of the moon goddess. It was actually Sapa Inca Atahualpa, the last Inca emperor, who called for the gathering of huge quantities of gold as a ransom to be paid to the conquistadores for his release. Much of that gold was melted down, and it produced over 24 tons of gold and silver. Atahualpa himself is reported to have possessed a solid gold litter, or palanquin, that weighed almost 200 pounds. His feet were not allowed to touch the ground when he went out in public. Here you see two examples that survived the conquest and were later found by archaeologists. The one on the left is, of course, a miniature llama. It is hollow. It is made from hammered out leaves of gold, and therefore it weighs very little and can fit in the palm of one's hand. You notice that it has big eyes and a mouth, and the llama appears to be smiling. Little pieces like this llama and the female figurine on the right have been unearthed all over Inca territory. They were often frequently buried as offerings at the top of sacred mountains. Again, the empire did not use money in its daily routines, nor did the empire have an extensive trading network. Much of what it needed was produced within the empire, and so there was little contact with other civilizations during this time. In the next slide, which is an overview, we have religion and cosmology. The Inca civilization was located in one of the most difficult terrains on Earth. Due to the harsh and unpredictable environment, the Inca religion often focused on rituals to win the favor of gods, who were often associated with natural forces such as the sun, water, and thunder. The Inca emperor was conceptualized as divine and was effectively head of state of the state religion. Next to him was the Wilak Umu, which translates into the priest who recounts, and he was the high priest of the sun. The emperor Pachacuti made Inti, the sun god, the most important Inca god, and proclaimed that the Sapa Inca, the supreme Inca, was the son of Inti. Other important gods included Viracocha, who was believed to have created all things, and that included the sun, moon, and stars, as well as the earth and human beings. And then there was Yapa, the thunder god, who was asked to provide rainfall at critical times during the agricultural cycle. To create and maintain relationships with their gods, the Inca gave them a variety of offerings. These included prayers, food, coca leaves, woven cloth, and animals. On rare occasions, such as natural disasters or wars, the Incas resorted to sacrificing animals. There is little evidence that the Inca engaged in human sacrifice. They also honored animals. To the Inca, the snake, the puma, and the condor are symbolic representative of the three levels in their cosmology. The snake represents the lower or underworld. The middle world of Earth is represented by the puma, and the heavens are represented by the condor. These three are sacred animals, the condor included, and they often are found not only in ruins, but as part of national flags. Among the Incas, the condor was the most sacred bird. Its large size and ability to travel long distances are some of the reasons why the Incas believed it to be the messenger for the heavens. It was one of the most sacred animals in their eyes because of its connection to the divine. It was considered a connection between the earth and the skies and was believed to carry the dead on its wings to the afterlife. The puma represented power and strength, but it was also a symbol of life on earth. It was important for the Incas to show the qualities of the puma in their lifetimes, as it was considered the greatest predator and something to emulate. Because of this, the Incas designed Cusco in the shape of the puma. The snake also was an important symbol to the Incas. It represented the underworld. And by the way, that has a different connotation than what the underworld has in Christianity. Rather than representing hell or being a sign of eternal punishment and temptations, the snake represented the beginning of a new life. In Inca mythology, the snake is also believed to represent wisdom and knowledge. Next slide, please. The founding myths. Manco Capac is considered as the founder of the Inca civilization. Now, the Incas have a number of origin myths. Manco Capac, also known as the royal founder, was also Manco Inca and Ayar Manco, and he often is central to many of these myths. Manco Capac is considered to be the son of either Viracocha, the great creator deity of the Inca, or Inti, the sun god and patron deity of the Inca. According to one of the origin myths, Ayar Manco and his siblings were sent by the Inti to look for a place to create civilization. They were given a magic staff that was made of the finest gold, and were told that they were to throw this staff into the ground. And when it sank into the ground, that is where they were to build the new city. According to the mythology and the origin myth, the staff sank in the ground, around which became Cusco. This led Ayar Manco in selecting Cusco as the place to found the Inca civilization, and since then he was known as Manco Capac. There is no substantial evidence, however, to confirm Manco Capac's existence, although the tendency is to believe that he did exist. And in fact, several historians regard him as the first governor and founder of the Inca civilization. Next slide, please. Certainly the center of the Inca cosmos was Coricancha. Coricancha translates into golden enclosure, and it was the most sacred part of Cusco and its most revered sacred space. This housed the images of the creator god Viracocha and the sun god Inti, as well as other Inca deities. Emanating out of the Coricancha were 41 sequas, or ritual pathways, that led to 328 sacred huacas outside of Cusco. These were sacred locations across the landscape, some in the form of natural features such as mountains, rocky outcrops, or water sources. The Coricancha was the epicenter of the Inca world, and its enclosure pre-studied the night sky, following the celestial movements of the Milky Way, or Mayu, that was perceived to reflect the cycle of life on Earth. The temple of the sun was covered in finely hammered gold sheets known as the sweat of the sun. Another temple to Quia, the goddess of the moon, was likewise covered in silver. The golden enclosure was made up of 6 chambers around a courtyard. The chambers held images of different deities. A special room was used for the storage of the mummies of the deceased emperors, called malkis. Now, these mummies played a real central role in Inca society. They were not entombed. In fact, they were preserved by the retinues of family members who were charged with taking care of them. These mummies were brought out on special occasion during festival days, but they were also often consulted in terms of crisis or in times when decisions had to be made. And so they played an important role in the governance of the Inca structure. These mummies were, to put it indelicately, freeze-dried, and that's how mummification was achieved. These mummies were dressed in the finest clothing. In fact, their clothing was changed every day. They were fed ceremonial meals, and they were cared for as if they were living beings. They were also seen as oracles, that could foretell the future for the Incas. This image, which is a reproduction, offers an insight into what the inside of the Coricancha might have looked like. Again, you can see the detail and the craftsmanship that went into the work in this area. Next slide, please. Here is a gold panel from the Coricancha, and it depicts the Inca cosmology, with the supreme creator Viracocha looking down on the sun god Inti. There also is the moon goddess Guia and the earth mother Pachamama, who was also the goddess of fertility. This panel is displayed in Cusco Santo Domingo Museum, and it gives one an idea of what the walls of Coricancha must have looked like before the Spanish arrived and took the gold. In the next slide, we see the complex cosmology that includes Viracocha, Inti, and Kia. Pachacuti was the first king of the Inca Empire. Viracocha, the grandson of Inca Roca, started to expand Inca territory. However, as I said earlier, a neighboring tribe, the warlike Chancas, attacked the Inca. Viracocha fled the invaders with his son and heir, Inca Urcan. However, another one of his sons, Inca Yupanqui, rallied some of the Inca soldiers and, according to legend, appealed to some of the tribes to join him in defending Cusco. He was successful in defeating the Chancas, and when Viracocha returned and named Inca Urcan as the emperor, the Inca nobles who had fought alongside Inca Yupanqui decided that he deserved to be made emperor. Yupanqui then changed his name to Pachucati, which means earth shaker, or he who overturns space and time. Again, as I said, Pachacuti is the one that began the expansion of the empire and transformed it significantly during his reign. In the next slide, we look at the cult of Inti, or the sun god. Inti, the sun god, was, after the creator god Viracocha, the most important god of Inca deities. The Incas believed that Viracocha was responsible for putting Inti into the sky, and early mythology established that the Inca emperors were direct descendants of Inti. It was Inti who gave the Inca emperor the divine right to rule, and Inti worship became a crucial means of maintaining the relationship between the power of the emperor and association with the gods. Neither Inti nor Viracocha were exclusively Inca deities. Inca peoples across the Andean region had long worshipped these gods before they were assimilated into the Inca pantheon. Inti was often portrayed by precursor peoples and by the Incas as a gold mask of a smiling human-like face with big eyes, of the type shown here in the zigzag rays of sunshine that you see in the upper right-hand corner. During the ceremonies honoring the Inti, priests at the Coricancha site saw an eagle fall from the sky, attacked by buzzards. Here was Inti expressing his anger and foretelling disaster of the Incas. The omen was reinforced by a new moon that had 3 halos, a black one signifying the demise of Inti, a smoky one foretelling the end of the Inca Empire, and a red one indicating potential conflict among the descendants of the founding Incas emperors. Again, omens had predicted the fall of the Aztec Empire as well. And similar omens had been predicting the arrival of these strangers from across the ocean. Next slide. The Sequas and the Huacas. The Inca landscape is charged with spiritual power and is dotted by a network of sacred shrines that are known as Huacas. that were connected to the center of Cusco by ritual pathways that were called sequas. For the Inca, the landscape was alive with sacred objects. Huacas could take the form of a natural feature in the landscape, a standing stone, water source, cave, or waterfall, and they were often elaborated with carvings and additional structures. Huacas have been documented around the capital, connected to the center by the spider's web of 41 lines of power. Each of the 4 suyus, or provinces, had 9 sequas. On the right, you see the highly carved monolith of the Huaca de Sayahuite. Shows how a naturally occurring rock could be transformed into a sacred object of pilgrimage. Huacas held their own specific meaning and served different purposes, such as guarding against illness or wishing for a good harvest. Next slide. We'll finish with the conquistadores. Here's a painting by the British artist John Everett Millais. And we see the conqueror Francisco Pizarro seizing the emperor Atahualpa in a daring battle that took place on August 29th, 1533, that brought the empire to an end. It is known as the Battle of Cajamarca. The question has been often posed, why was it that a small force of men, Pizarro commanded probably no more than 180 men on this expedition, bring down an empire as vast and as powerful as the Inca Empire? And there are many reasons, not just one reason, that brought the empire down. Yes, the Spaniards had advantages that the Incas did not. For example, they had horses. The Incas had never seen horses. The Spaniards had weapons, such as steel swords and blunderbusses. They also brought with them an unexpected ally in the form of the disease. But certainly that alone doesn't explain the fall of the empire. Prior to the arrival of Pizarro, a smallpox epidemic had broken out in Inca Empire, which had led to the death of millions. It is estimated that the smallpox epidemic caused between 65 to 90% of the population to die. The Inca Emperor Huayna Capac at that time and his eldest son and designated heir, Ninan Koreshik, caught smallpox and both died suddenly in 1527. Huayna had many legitimate and illegitimate children, and he died before he could nominate or name a new heir. The choice then fell between 2 of his sons, born of different mothers. One son's name was Huascar, and the other son's name was Atahualpa. Both vied for control of the Inca Empire, and it led to a civil war, known in history as the War of the Two Brothers. The war began in 1529 and ended when Atahualpa defeated his brother in 1532. Now, Pizarro had reached the territory in 1526, but did not return until he was given permission by the governor to undertake the conquest of the Inca Empire. So he returned in 1529 to Spain, received royal approval to conquer the region, and be its viceroy. When the Spanish, led by Pizarro, returned to Peru in 1532, the Inca Civil War and the European diseases had already caused a great deal of damage to the Inca Empire, and it had weakened it considerably. But there was another problem that was affecting the Inca Empire on the eve of its conquest. There was flawed governance. It was becoming more difficult to keep the empire together. The empire had grown very rapidly, bringing together diverse ethnic groups whose many languages and customs made for complex government and a growing lack of cohesion. In the first decades of the 16th century, the empire's outer reaches were increasingly prone to local insurrections. Previously, such insurrections or rebellions would have been ruthlessly quashed, but the military was overextended and there was a cumbersome bureaucratic structure that made it difficult to govern. An inherent flaw to the government lay in the extreme centralization of government. Previously, when the empire was more compact, communications up and down the lines from Cusco were efficient and rapid, thanks to the excellent system of roads and the speed and efficiency of the chasquis, or the messengers. By the way, chasquis could cover collectively about 150 miles per day, or per week. No, I'm sorry, per day. However, as the empire grew, such communication became increasingly time-consuming and prone to misinterpretation. Then there were the issues of succession that led to the Civil War. When Atahualpa met with the Spaniards, much of his army was deployed elsewhere. When he met with the Spaniards, he brought with him 6,000 warriors. He asked them to not carry their weapons because it might provoke the Spaniards. That gave the Spaniards an advantage. By the time that the attack against the Incas was over, 1,500 Incas lay dead. Atahualpa was captured and held prisoner. Pizarro demanded a huge ransom, which was given to him. Nonetheless, even though he had promised to allow Atahualpa to live, he ordered his execution. And so, flawed governance, an overextended empire, succession issues which led to a civil war, and disease, when added to the military abilities and weapons that the Spaniards brought, marked the end of the Inca Empire. In the next slide, we can talk about Inca culture today. The Inca tradition never really died out and continues to thrive despite the conquest by the Spaniards. Currently, they are enjoying a renaissance, thanks in no small part to the legend of Incari, or the Inca king, a character who is crucial to the Inca cycles of life, death, and rebirth. Excuse me. Incari is a central figure in the post-conquest belief that the glories of the Inca Empire will one day be restored. Legend has it that Atahualpa's death at the hands of the Spanish, he vowed to return and to avenge his death. According to this legend, the conquistadors buried his dismembered body in several places around the kingdom. The Incas believe that one day he will rise from these places, take back his kingdom, and restore harmony between the earth goddess Pachamama and her children. In so doing, he will fulfill the ancient belief in Pachacuti, the cycle of life and death, and the continuing revolution of time and space. Nowadays, on June 24th, the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere, the festival of Inti Raymi explodes in Cusco as a celebration of the sun god. It is classified, it is characterized by processions of mummies through the streets, and thousands of people gathered in the Plaza de Armas to witness the arrival of colorful representations from the four suyus, or provinces of the empire. There is a ceremonial reading of the coca leaves to foretell the future of the empire in the years to come. And then the festival moves to the sacred grounds of Sacsayhuaman, where huge crowds watch and dance, rituals that honor the sun god, Inti Raymi. The Inca culture is indeed still thriving across the mountain regions of Andes. This concludes my presentation on the Incas. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that you may have in the time remaining. I have a question here from Shelton in Silver Springs, United States. He asked, who was Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala? How was his contribution to the preservation of Inca history and our knowledge of daily life within Inca culture? His contribution was that he wrote a very extensive letter that became sort of a chronicle of the Incan history, in which he not only talked about Inca culture and civilization, but also included illustrations to demonstrate various aspects of life. The letter really, which was, very long, was sent to the king to be read. And of course, the letter was never read, but it was preserved in the Spanish archives. And so it was discovered many years later and deciphered because he was able to speak Spanish and Quechua. And therefore, we learn more from a descendant of Inca about Incan society. Benjamin from Pasadena asks, is there any evidence that the Incas made boats to sail or explore the Pacific? Could it have been possible for them to contact native island cultures? That's a good question. I've never run across any evidence that the Incas ventured much beyond their empire. In fact, when I look at the history of the Incas, I see them sort of as an isolationist group. They believed that they were the pinnacle of civilization, that other civilizations were there to conquer and exploit and subjugate, and that there was no need to interact with people from other areas. Otherwise, it might contaminate their society and culture and maybe even threaten their existence. Peter from Winston-Salem says, was the use of guinea pig in Christ's meal in the painting, The Last Supper, housed in Cusco Catholic Church, truly helpful in converting the indigenous natives of the area by the Spanish? That's a good question. The Incan diet was largely plant-based. They did not consume a great deal of meat. When they did, they consumed either meat from the llamas or they also ate guinea pigs. And so the inclusion of the guinea pig might be a reference to that practice. The Spanish converting the indigenous natives of the area into Catholicism was really an imposed religion. And like other places in the Western Hemisphere, the indigenous people, what they did was they took their religion that had Catholicism superimposed upon it, and they kept practicing that. For example, the ceremony that is celebrated today in Peru, the Corpus Christi celebration, really is a celebration of Inca traditions and religious beliefs that have had Catholicism superimposed upon it. Is it possible, Billy from Southampton, United Kingdom, is it possible to visit Machu Picchu with Viking? I think it is, although you have to understand that in order to visit Machu Picchu from the city of Cusco, it's a 4-hour train ride and then a harrowing drive up the mountain on bus. If you get up to Machu Picchu, then you have to worry about the thin atmosphere, and some people suffer from altitude sickness. But it's well worth the visit if you can make it. Frazier from the United States asks, how do the Inca compare to other civilizations of the same period around the world in terms of their level of advancement? You mentioned that they didn't have yet have the wheel, but I wonder what other tools and innovations they did have. I think that when you compare the Inca and the time that they existed, they were far superior in their levels of advancement to other civilizations, even surpassing the great Mayan civilizations and the great Aztec civilizations. One thing that I didn't mention in my presentation was that they also were advanced medically, that they performed skull surgery, and that they were people that were able to address some serious illnesses before the arrival of the Europeans. They didn't have the wheel, but what other tools and innovations they had? I think that they were just master builders and architects, and that they were able to use tools effectively in terms of the construction. Certainly, their innovations were in the way that they, for example, bolstered Machu Picchu. When they built Machu Picchu, they started building terraces from the ground up in order to protect the mountain from collapsing upon itself. Also, they used water quite effectively, although water was a danger to them. For example, in Machu Picchu, there was a mountain stream that they used to direct into the city to provide the city not only with water, but with fantastic fountains. So they were full of innovations that they were able to apply in dealing with the harsh landscape in which they lived. What first intrigued you to pursue these studies? Well, I teach the history of the Americas, and I early on focused on the civilizations of the Mayans, the Toltecs, the Olmecs, and the Aztecs. But I found that, of course, I was excluding a large part of the Americas by not studying their civilizations. And so I began to delve more into those civilizations that preceded the Incas. But then the Incas came up, and as I began to do more research, I was really amazed at what they had accomplished in such a short span of time. Charles from the United States asked, how effective were the relatively crude guns used by the Spanish in achieving military superiority? They were effective in only helping to contribute to the disarray and confusion. Some of the native people that they encountered considered the blast of cannons to be thunder from the gods. But really, the most effective weapons were disease and the steel blades and the armor and the horses that they used quite effectively. In some cases, the Spaniards also brought large dogs with them, which often charged into the enemy, causing confusion and disarray that helped them achieve military victory over their adversaries. Christopher from Dallas asks, is there still an Incan ruling or ceremonial dynasty, although it might be official? Not that I know of, although many people claim to be descendants from the Inca civilization. But there certainly is, there are people within the village, the Ayus still exist. These are the extended families and biological families, and they can trace their ancestry back to the Ayus that existed and the rulers that existed during Inca civilization. And so during Incan ceremonies, those families play a central role in celebrating those ceremonies. Poonam from Houston wants to know, is it possible to approach me via my emails? Absolutely. I'm always happy to answer questions. I am sorry that I can only give you a brief overview of the Inca Empire because there's so much more to delve into, but I hope this has given you kind of a good introduction into the various aspects of Inca society, culture, civilization, and why they rose and why they fell so quickly. I do not see any more. See if I can find some more questions here. I think I've answered most of the questions. Am I ignoring someone or forgetting someone out there? Karen from Silver Spring says, do you think there are any other great discoveries of Inca ruins still found to be found one day? Yes, I do. There are many sites that have remained unexplored, and archaeologists and anthropologists, hydrologists continue to explore the vast landscape that was once the Inca Empire. Donald Bradenton from the United States says, one of your pictures showed spears with what appears to be steel blades prior to the Spanish. Did they have iron prior to the Spanish? No, they did not. And I don't know what that spear really consists of, but it certainly was not iron or steel. Thank you to Virginia for the comment. I appreciate it. You are most welcome, Teresa from Upland. I think we have enough questions, I really appreciate your attention and time to this. I look forward to making other presentations for the Viking organization. They are a wonderful group of people, very professional, very well prepared and organized, and it's always a pleasure to work with them. Saxa Weman, our guide said, try to remember sexy woman. I'll remember that because that's a real tongue twister. I saw a report that access to Machu Picchu might be even more limited in the future due to the ecological impact of tourists. That is correct. I mean, as with most historical sites, the heavy influx of visitors can often do a great deal of damage, even if unintended, to these sites. And so in order to protect the integrity of this magnificent site, I think that they might have to limit the incursion of large numbers of people into the area. Thanks to all of you. I hope you all have a good day. Stay safe. And I look forward to seeing some of you on future Viking lectures and on maybe some of the cruises. Please take care and thank you for your time.